Hello again, I'm Dr. Chad Price, and this is part 2 of a series on bone quality. So I hope you'll stick with me for about 10 minutes to hear about the other nutrients that are important for bone health. And these are in addition to calcium and vitamin D that are very important for bone formation and maintenance. We'll talk some about silicon, magnesium, vitamin K, boron, and other nutrients. I first became aware of silicon because of some research work that I was doing with something called silicated bone graft substitutes. And in these, the silicon is substituted for less than 1% of the calcium. And it had some remarkable properties compared to other bone graft substitutes. It turns out that silicated bone graft substitutes can induce bone formation even when they're implanted into muscle. So they don't have to be in contact with bone. They have bone induction properties that seem to be generated by the silicon. This quotation from an article in the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery also states, quote, "The importance of low levels in silicon in stimulating bone metabolism in humans has also been suggested by the association of increased dietary silicon intake with increased bone mass." So if you take silicon in your nutrition, it is associated with increased bone mass. Further, it stated silicon may be involved in an early stage of bone calcification. Further studies have shown that silicon is actually 25 times more concentrated in bone-forming protein than in mature bone. And silicon helps the bone calcify and then it leaves the bone. So silicon is acting a little bit like a catalyst to bring calcium to the bone, or at least to the protein that's going to become bone. After the silicon's done its job, then the excess is excreted so it doesn't build up in the body. This means that there's no silicon in dried bone. So it's done its job and it leaves. And if you analyze dried bone, you don't find silicon. A lot of our nutritional products for calcium are based on basically dead bone. So bone meal or even microcrystalline hydroxyapatite from Australian cow bones is essentially dead bone, as is coral calcium and oyster shell calcium. And these things are found in nature. The animals don't eat these in order to make their bones healthier. This is the end product of bone. It's the stuff that's left over after all the protein is gone and after all the bone-forming elements are gone. So what we really should be focusing on is what forms living bone and not on eating the proper type of dead bone. So bone health depends on the nutrients that form bone and the minerals that are in bone, of course. And calcium and vitamin D are important, but they aren't the only nutrients that form bone. Silicon, vitamin K, inositol, boron, magnesium, arginine, vitamin C, these are the things that are needed to build bone. And we'll take a minute with this chart because it's very important. You'll find that many of these are insufficient in the average American diet. So across the top you see the nutrient, you see the recommended daily amount for bone health, and then the median intake. And median intake means that half of all Americans fall below that level. This is not the average intake. The average would be the average of everyone, but the median is just where the center falls. So if you look at silicon, the amount that's been associated with better bone health is 40 milligrams. But over half of all Americans are receiving less than 21 milligrams in their normal foods. Boron likewise, 3 milligrams is associated with better bone health, but the median intake is 1 milligram. Vitamin K, 110 micrograms, is associated with lower fracture risk, but the median intake is 75 micrograms. In fact, 25% of Americans are getting less than 60 micrograms of vitamin K, or less than half the amount that's associated with decreased fractures. Magnesium, recommended amount 400 milligrams. Half of Americans are taking in less than 240 milligrams. Now we're doing a little bit better with vitamin C, where the recommendation is 75 milligrams, and the median intake is 68 milligrams. And we've already talked about vitamin D and calcium in our previous talk. Well, what is silicon? Silicon occurs in nature, but the pure element does not occur in nature. Silicon's most common form is silicon dioxide, which is quartz or sand. So silicon is actually the second most common element in the Earth's crust. It's all around us and it's harmless. But the silicon dioxide form is not absorbed. Silicon is also a semiconductor that's used in the electronics industry. And this is why they call Silicon Valley the origin of our computer programs, because silicon is used in this microelectronic circuitry. Because silicon has some unique properties that are called piezo-resistive properties. What happens to silicon is it can change its electrical activity when a mechanical stress is applied. So it's used in micro pressure sensors. It can sense pressure, and it gives off a negative electron. That negative electron may be what's attracting calcium, because calcium has positive ions. It turns out that bone also has negative electrical charges that are created in response to mechanical loading. This is thought to be the way that exercise causes bone to increase in density, because when you put compression on bone, like resistance weight training, then on the compression of bone, it generates these negative electrical charges, and that causes more bone to form. So it's actually possible that silicon could be an important link between exercise and increased bone density. There's been some osteoporosis research with silicon, quite a bit in fact, and it's been found that silicon, just oral silicon, reduces osteoporosis by decreasing bone resorption and stimulating bone formation. And these various studies were using just some dietary silicon supplementation. Epidemiological studies, which are studies of large populations of humans, have looked at silicon in the diet and daily intake. The Framingham Offspring Cohort Study is one, and there's a study from Scotland called the Aberdeen Prospective Osteoporosis Study. Both of these studies found that there's increased bone mineral density in men and in premenopausal women when the intake was more than 40 milligrams per day of silicon. It's interesting that no postmenopausal women achieved more than 40 milligrams per day, and the average intake for postmenopausal women was 18 milligrams per day. Other epidemiological studies have shown that regions of the world with the highest natural silicon in the diet, such as India and southern China, because they have a lot of whole grains and they have high silicon content in the foods just from the soil, they also have the very lowest rates of hip fractures anywhere in the world. This is encouraging evidence that silicon may be a useful supplement to help bone health. Well, where do we get silicon? Silicon, as we said, is taken into the plants from the soil, and it concentrates in whole grains, green beans, some fruits. It's in bananas, but it's not bioavailable. In other words, the form in banana is a little more like silicon dioxide. It's there, but it doesn't get into your system. There are some water-soluble forms called orthosilicic acid, and this is found in some natural artesian waters and in waters that bubble up through volcanic soils. Now, when you consume silicon, it is absorbed, it's utilized, or it's excreted. It doesn't get stored in your body. It doesn't stay in your body unless you need it. And there are no harmful effects except that experimental amounts that have been given to animals of huge amounts, 500 milligrams a day, half a gram a day, may decrease calcium absorption, but it's virtually impossible to get those levels through any dietary or supplemental source. So what's the best source for dietary silicon? Surprisingly, it's beer. Because of the fermentation of hops and barley, it releases the silicon into the beer. And there's a report that shows greater bone density has been found in beer-drinking women. So I'm not suggesting that everyone go out and drink beer, because alcohol is not that great for your bones. But there is a lot of silicon in beer if you don't overconsume it. And even the non-alcoholic beer, has some silicon. Remember that variety, moderation, and balance are the pillars of nutrient intake. So there's no magic bullet. Silicon is not the magic bullet for bone health. Neither is calcium or vitamin D or vitamin K or anything else. It's really the moderation and balance of all of these things that are important, so we don't want to overemphasize any one of them. It's unlikely that a single food component from the many hundreds that make up one's diet will be the answer to any disease. So let's look at magnesium. Again, a report from the National Institutes of Health that has associated low levels of magnesium intake with osteoporosis. And we've already shown that more than half of the people in the United States have insufficient intake of magnesium. In fact, supplemental magnesium increases bone density in postmenopausal women. The major effect of magnesium is for spine density. So it may be more important for cancellous bone, which is the spongy bone in your vertebra, than it is for cortical bone. The hard shell of bone is called cortical bone, and silicon seems to have more effect for cortical bone, while magnesium may have more effect for the spongy bone that's inside, and also the bone that's in your vertebra. Again, all of these different things are important, and not just one. So what about vitamin K? As we said, half the population of the United States consumes less than the recommended dietary allowance of vitamin K, and more than 109 micrograms per day is associated with decreased risk of hip fracture in postmenopausal women. So you can get vitamin K in your diet, but not enough people are eating as many leafy green vegetables as they should. Now what happens with vitamin K is it works together with vitamin D. Now, vitamin D stimulates the formation of a protein called osteocalcin, and this is a bone-forming protein that's very important. But it doesn't work unless it has vitamin K, because the vitamin K has to convert the osteocalcin to something called carboxylated osteocalcin, which is the more active form. There are studies that show that vitamin K and vitamin D increase mineralization more than either one alone. So once again, it's helpful to have vitamin D and vitamin K. There are other nutritional factors too, and we're not going to go into all of them just in the interest of time. You can refer back to the publications if you're more interested in this subject. But proteins and amino acids improve calcium absorption. There's something called inositol, which is in citrus and cantaloupe, and phytates, which are in beans and some other whole grains. Inositol actually decreases bone resorption, and it increases the mineralization of bone. There's one study in animals in which they used some radioactive calcium, and they traced it to see whether it went into bone or not. And then they gave half the animals inositol, and half the animals they just gave them a regular diet. The animals that received the inositol had 48% more calcification than the animals that had a regular diet. So inositol is a pretty interesting thing that can help bone mineralization. Boron too. Boron stables and extends the half-life of vitamin D and estrogen. It has some other properties such as helping the retention and utilization of magnesium and calcium. So there are many nutritional factors that are important for bone formation. In summary, vitamin D and calcium are very important for bone health. But we really need to pay more attention to the lesser-known nutritional components of bone health: silicon, vitamin K, magnesium, boron, inositol, just to name a few. Thank you very much for listening. Please feel free to look around the rest of the website and contact us if you have any questions. Thank you very much.